There is objection. Question number 1, the Right Honourable Winston Peters.
Mr. Speaker, this question is to the Prime Minister and asks, does he stand by all his statements regarding the Northland by-election?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Speaker, yes, in the context they were given.
Supplementary question, the Right Honourable Winston Peters.
Does he stand by his statement regarding the 10 one-lane bridges, and I quote him, "These bridges need upgrading, and they will be," end of quotes. And if so, how does he explain a massive variation in costings of between $32 and $69 million?
The Right Honourable Winston
Speaker,
Peters.
to answer the first part of the question, yes. In answer to the second part of the question, all the work has been done to be absolutely sure of what the final costs will be. That's standard whenever we do procurement around new infrastructure like roading.
Supplementary question, the Right Honourable Winston Peters.
Whose idea was it to double lane the 10 bridges, and on what date was he informed that the announcement would be made?
Right
Speaker,
Honourable Prime Minister.
In answer to the first part of the question, the Cabinet.
Supplementary question, Right Honourable Winston Peters.
Well, how does he square that answer with the Northland National Party candidate's statement that it was his idea? Who is not telling the truth here?
Order. Order. The question's been asked. The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Speaker, the member didn't ask me where the idea originated from.
Supplementary question. Order. Supplementary question, right? Order.
Point of order.
Order. Point of order, Ron Mark.
Mr. Speaker, I know that you study the Hansards with answers, questions and answers, and I know that you're fully aware that these questions were asked on the 10th of March and on the 17th of March, and that the ministers and the Cabinet, and particularly Mr Transport, have had all that time to get these answers right and to be able to answer them truthfully in the House. I'd ask that you require them to do that.
Order. I'm not sure that's a point of order, but if the member thinks that an answer's been given in this House that's incorrect, there's an appropriate way to deal with that, and it's not via a point of order. Speaking to the point of order, Ron Mark.
But surely, Mr Speaker, it would be far cheaper for the taxpayer if we don't go through the Privileges Committee.
Order. The member will resume his seat. That is certainly not a clarification, and it's not a point of order. Supplementary question, Right Honourable Winston Peters.
Supplementary question. Is he in favour of the Darby and Joan Bridge being double-laned, considering that it would require cutting down 2 landmark protected native kauri trees, and that very low numbers of vehicles actually use the bridge, often just to see those kauri trees?
Right Honourable
Speaker,
Prime Minister.
I'm advised the member's incorrect in the assumptions he made in this question.
Supplementary question, the Right Honourable Winston Peters.
No, Mr. Speaker, I don't want a supplementary question.
Oh, point of order, the
Yes.
Right Honourable Winston Peters.
Speaker, what has happened here is the Prime Minister's got up and challenged the very veracity of the question, which simply was, it's a landmark
Order,
bridge.
this is a point of order.
It got an environmental award because it harmonises with the 2 kauri trees.
Order.
And he says I'm incorrect with my assumptions.
Order. No, I don't need assistance from the member. I don't need... The member asked the question. The Prime Minister disputed the facts that are in that question. That is the right of the Prime Minister. The way forward is supplementary questions.
Speaker.
No, order. I've ruled on this matter. I'm not putting up with the repetition of yesterday where my points...
I'm not being put...
Would the member sit down? Member, sit down. Order. I'm very tempted to be asking the member to leave. Now, the member can continue asking a supplementary question if he has them left, but I have ruled that the question that was asked has been addressed.
Supplementary question.
Supplementary question, the Right Honourable Winston Peters.
When I said that somebody was in favour of the Darby and Joan Bridge being double-laned and that it would end the landmark historical and environmental award given to this bridge because of the kauri trees that have to be cut down, which one of those assumptions was wrong?
The
Speaker.
Right Honourable Prime Minister.
That wasn't the question the member asked me.
Point of order, Right
Mr.
Honourable
Speaker, I have studied the Westminster system all around the world, and I have never seen such a pathetic set of questions being answered that way.
Order. A point of order has been called. I will listen to it, and I expect to listen to it in silence. Now, would the member quickly get to his point of order?
My point of order is I'm asking the Prime Minister to outline what assumptions he says we have got wrong in our questions on this matter.
Order. I'll hear now from the Honourable Jerry Brunley.
Mr Speaker, I think the problem here is that had Mr Peters been able to table a full design specification for the renewed Derby Jones and Jones Bridge, then he might be able to make the assertions he has. But he can't, and he doesn't need to make those assertions until that is the case.
I'm not sure that helps us forward. In this case, the Right Honourable Winston Peters has now... No, I'm on my feet. Has repeated now a question which is not the question he asked. And that's the difficulty. The question was a very long-winded question. The Prime Minister has addressed that question. I accept, not to the member's satisfaction. Order. The way forward is further supplementary questions. It's not to then question the answer that's been given.
Order.
A point of order, the Right Honourable Winston Peters.
I asked this question number 4, and one way the answer was that I got the assumptions wrong. I asked the question in a different way.
Order. Again, I've dealt with this. Sit down. The member asked the question. The Prime Minister addressed the question. I've said to my satisfaction, I accept it's not to the member's satisfaction, the way forward is further supplementaries. Supplementary question, the Right Honourable Winston Peters.
Is he in favour of the Derby and Jones Bridge being double-laned, considering that it would require cutting down 2 landmark protected native kauri trees, and that very low numbers of vehicles actually use the bridge, often just to see those trees?
Right Honourable Prime Minister.
In answer to the first part of the question, yes. In answer to the second part of the question, the member's wrong. Trees won't be cut down.
Question number 2, Alistair Scott.
To the Minister of Finance.